More Tales Told by a Dubliner by Turlough Conmee. Story number 12. Harry Clarke's Unquiet Grave. I was living for years in Chur in the Grisons Alps, thinking I was the only Irish lad there, before I heard the whole sorry story of Harry Clarke. Harry Clarke was a Dubliner like myself, and we both went to the same school. But he was born before the beginning of the 20th century, quite a bit before my time. He was an artist, one of the finest of his generation. He mainly worked in stained glass, and he provided windows for many churches in Ireland and elsewhere. He also did stained glass of a secular nature, illustrating poetry and literature. He was renowned, too, for his striking and unusual illustrations of books published in England, such as a collection of Poe's tales, the fairy stories of Hans Christian Andersen, and an English version of Goethe's Faust. All this would have made him fairly prosperous, but his health failed him. He suffered from tuberculosis, and like so many patients at that time, he made his way to the sanatoriums at Davos in the Grisons Alps. He was there in 1929 and 1930. Now, Davos, with its pure mountain air, was fashionable, but it really didn't do the patients all that much good, and Harry Clarke must have become very disillusioned with his progress, for in the new year in 1931 he suddenly decided to go back to Dublin. Maybe he had the feeling that the end was nigh, and he wanted to be with his family. Anyway, during the day of January the 5th, when the Alps would have been covered with snow and ice, he boarded the little red train at the narrow gauge railway going down the mountain to unquiet and Coire. As I understand it, he spent the night in Coire, and being unable to travel onwards, he died there the next day. His wife and family were duly informed, and they decided to bury him there in Coire, perhaps to avoid the expense of bringing the body back for burial to Dublin. His wife, also a well-known painter, and their 3 children made the trip to Coire. She had a large imposing gravestone made that said, Harry Clarke, Artist. A vacant plot was bought in the cemetery behind the cathedral. After the funeral mass and the burial, the family went back to Ireland. Then, of course, after a few years, there was war in Europe, and there was no further communication between Ireland and the continent. Finally, in 1970, the eldest son was able to travel to Chur to visit his father's grave. You can imagine his perplexity when he went to the cemetery and found no headstone. It was eventually explained to him that the grave plot was only assigned to the deceased for a limited time, say 10 or 15 years, after which the body would be dug up and deposited somewhere else, and the gravestone, unless claimed by the family, would be taken away and broken up. In fact, according to cemetery records, the grave of Harry Clarke was aufgehoben, or abolished, in 1945. It was now hosting the second tenant since that time. As for Harry Clarke himself, his body had been spirited away and consigned to a common burial plot elsewhere. You can imagine the son's consternation when he was told this. For in Ireland, at least since the days of the British regime, the unspoken rule was one man, one grave. In other words, your final resting place was precisely that, and once you were deposited in the clay, you could count on not being disturbed till the trump of doom. As a frequent visitor to the peaceful cemeteries of Chur on me solitary walks, I was appalled myself when I found out about this legal framework for graves. To think of a couple of disreputable characters, like the sack-em-ups in the Victorian era, arriving at your grave at midnight with a horse and cart and spades, and them digging you up, loading your worm-eaten coffin on the back of the cart, breaking up your headstone and loading the bits of it into the cart beside your coffin, and then with creaking wheels and the clip-clop of horses' hooves, you're off on a new last journey to some other place, where a yawning pit lies open, ready to receive the mouldered coffins of countless unfortunates like you, hurled in and piled on top of one another to share in unhallowed oblivion. They're like the dead on a battlefield, where friend and foe mingle forever under a common mound in the place where they fell. O nameless unspeakable horror! O ignoble treatment at the hands of the nation that brought us the cuckoo clock! A few shovelfuls of earth to cover the ignominy of the bursting coffin, with skeletal limbs trailing out of it, and the cart leaves quietly, the sack-em-ups smoking their pipes that glow an eerie red in the darkness, and the ride back into the city, stopping perhaps at the stonemason's yard to deposit the broken headstone, for perhaps it may be remade into a grave marker for some other unfortunate. Harry Clarke's burial and reburial is a fait accompli. He can't be dug up like Yeats in Roquebrune in the south of France and repatriated to the Irish churchyard of his choice, for no one could now find the body of Harry Clarke. Come to think of it, no one could be sure they really had the body of Yeats, what with the cemetery at Roquebrune being destroyed by shelling during the war. But that's another story. I looked into the history of Chur cemeteries, and until comparatively recent decades, the only anonymous plot was in what is called the Totengut, or the Dead Man's Land, a cemetery further out the valley of the Plessur River. So, if Harry Clarke was moved to an anonymous communal plot, it could only have been there. Sure enough, if you walk out the valley of the Plessur to the bridge and go across into the Totengut, you'll find a communal plot presided over by a graceful statue of a Grecian muse holding a flaming torch. Underneath is a line from a local poet that says, Auch euch, die keiner mit Namen nennt, leuchtet die Flamme der ewigen Liebe. For you too, whom no one now mentions by name, the flame of eternal love still burns. It's a pleasant, peaceful place, and I've often gone there on walks. But once I heard the story of poor Harry Clarke, and had figured out for myself where he must lie, the place took on a new significance for me. As the only Irish lad in the city, it fell to me to keep his memory green. So, on the eve of the Epiphany last year, I bought a single red rose and laid it on the communal grave before the muse in the Totengut. The next night, the night of January the 6th, I happened to look out on the usually deserted cobblestoned laneway that runs before the old house where I live, and saw a tall young man in coat and hat pacing restlessly up and down. He looked up expectantly once in a while, as if he was waiting to be noticed. Under the broad brim of the hat, his face was pale. I didn't recognise it, but it looked familiar, as if I had seen it in photographs. I went and stood at the window and looked out. Seeing me, He stood still, facing me, and held up something in his hand. It was a single red rose. I went out into the hall and opened the front door of the house. From the steps I looked down at the young man waiting for me. "Harry," I called. "Harry Clarke?" "Yes," he said, as I approached, pulling on my overcoat. "Thank you for remembering me. But on the day I died, that one day in the year, I cannot rest. I must walk abroad, here in this wintry city that is so strange to me. I came to you, hoping for solace." "Then I will walk with you, for I know this city well. I'll be your guide." "But why can you not rest?" "If you know about me, and know my story, and found the place where my body lies, then you know why I have no rest. I died in a place that was strange to me. Like the three kings of Orient, I was seeking a destination. I longed to go home, but I could not, and died here. But the people here would not let me rest, and took my body from my grave, and cast me in a cold corner of the woods, unmarked, unmourned, unremembered. I am consigned to this cold purgatory amid the frozen Alps." "Well, so am I said. "So let us walk, and try to keep warm through the long winter's night." "Where to then?" he asked, with a sad smile. "We will walk to all the places in Coire that you have known, dying or dead." "We can do that in a night," he said thoughtfully. "Then at dawn I must depart." "Let's begin then," I said. "We'll go up to the bishop's court and the cathedral, and in behind the cathedral is a graveyard where you once lay." He nodded. We started up the hill, up the flight of stone steps and through the gateway in the massive stone tower. Then we walked across the silent empty court, past the cathedral, and up the steps into the cemetery behind it. Here the rows of graves shone eerily under the light of the full moon in the cold dark sky. It's a lovely spot there, but especially by day, when you can view the Alps all around, the Plessur Valley below, and the hills of Lenzerheide in the middle distance. "Your grave was here somewhere, judging by the photograph," I said, leading me companion among the gravestones. "Yes, here I think it was," I said, and we stopped before a strange headstone with a strange name. Harry sighed. "Poor bugger," I murmured. "After he has had his 10 or 20 years, they'll dig him up and cast him forth, skeleton, mouldy, coffin and all." We left the cemetery on the other side, as the chimes in the clock tower of the cathedral were striking 11. We walked down the hill till we came to the half-frozen waters of the Plessur, and walked out the valley along its banks. We came to the bridge leading to the Totengut. "One night it must have been in 1945, I said, "when they hauled your body in a cart to deposit it here." He nodded, but spoke not a word. We walked together across the bridge, the waters of the Plessur rushing beneath us. We entered the Totengut. As always, votive lamps gleamed ghostly red among the recent graves. Beyond a grove of trees, we saw the grey figure of the Muse, presiding as always over her cohort of nameless dead. We stood before this extensive pit, strewn with votive offerings, and Harry shivered. "Down there somewhere your body lies, broken and shattered no doubt, and mingled with the bones of countless others." Harry shook his head and groaned. "What use was it to work with so much care as I did at my art? All is broken up, all is lost. The artist's work is no more. But not the praise, said a woman's voice. It was the muse who spoke from atop her inscribed pedestal. The artist's glory remains, and his works are looked at and enjoyed from generation to generation. Thank you, said Harry with a sigh, looking up at the woman of stone, whose face had lightened in the moon's glow. I am the muse of memory, she went on, and you are remembered. Why, they appreciate your work more now than when you were alive. It's true, I said. All the stained glass, even the secular work, is known and loved, but it wasn't always so. You know that. Well, I know it now, Harry said, and I'm glad. Now we go back into town, I told him. We left the Totengut, and this time we walked through the woods till we came to the wooden footbridge that crosses the river just above St. Hilary's waterfall, which springs from the top of a cliff above and wets the mossy rocks all around, so that in the depths of winter they're covered in long icicles and look like a ghostly mute organ with its gleaming pipes. The bridge trembled under me footfalls, but not under Harry Clarke's. We walked onwards, along the lane, past the stonemason Bianchi's house and workshop. There, I said, I'll bet your gravestone was made, and when it was broken up and dug out, it was returned here to the stonemason to see if he could make a headstone for some other tenant of some grave. We soon found ourselves back in the winding cobblestone streets of the old city, and we walked down the Reichsgasse at the back of the Rathaus, the old town hall. There, I said, pointing to a house on the other side of the street, is Angelika Kauffmann's house. At least the house she was born in. Now it's a cafe. I didn't know she was from Chur, said Harry. Let's go and talk to her, I said. We went in the dark glass door. The cafe was empty. There was just some candlelight. We made out the figure of a woman in 18th century dress, seated at a table. We went up to her. May we join you? I asked. I want to introduce someone. She nodded. Accompanying me tonight is a gentleman named Harry Clarke, an artist, and he's from Dublin. Ah, she said. I was in Dublin one time. I painted portraits and decorated interiors there. Of course, said Harry Clarke. We know about you. We sat down at the table opposite her. Harry is mainly a stained glass artist, I said. He did some very innovative work, including some non-religious work. Really, she said with interest. Aye, I went on. He's also an illustrator of fine editions for publishers in London. Good, she said. I spent many years in London, as no doubt you know. We nodded. So what brings you to Coire, Mr. Clarke? She asked. Harry sighed. I'm buried here. Ah, yes, she said. I'm sorry to hear it. I have no connection with Coire, really, he explained, other than being dead. I was travelling for my health, stopped here one night, and died, and was buried. Well then, Angelika Kauffmann said thoughtfully, you have the same connection with Coire that I do, one due entirely to chance. I happened to be born here, quite by chance. You happened to die here, quite by chance. Isn't that it? Harry nodded glumly. Many of the decisive things in our lives are due to chance, Angelika went on. We just have to make the most of them. She looked at us. I was born in Coire. We left again soon after. I lived in Italy, in Rome and other places. I met English gentry on the Grand Tour. They invited me to England. I went and lived in London. I travelled over to Dublin, again invited by patrons, and spent 6 months there. Then back to London, where I ended up marrying an Italian artist. We travelled to Italy and settled in Rome. That was my last stop. What it all means, what it all amounts to, I still don't know. She smiled. I have no reason to be in Coire, said Harry, other than being dead. At least none that I can discover. He finds it's a cold purgatory, I added. He can't rest. His grave was disturbed. Ah, yes, she said, but that would not help. But make the most of the chance, or go to a higher level. Tonight is Epiphany night. The 3 kings are travelling. Perhaps like them you can see a star and find your way to Bethlehem. We must be on our way, I said, and we rose. It was a pleasure and an honour to talk with you, Harry told her. It made Coire more acceptable to me as a sojourn beyond death. I am glad, she said with a slight bow. May blessings be on your way. Look out for a star. We made our way out of the darkened cafe, and once again we stood alone on the Reichsgasse. Where to now? Asked Harry. Well, I thought we should go down to the Bahnhofstrasse, to the station. We'll be retracing your steps to where you arrived in Chur. Harry nodded, and we walked onwards till we came to the station. It was now very late. The clock tower of St. Martin's was striking 3. And the station was deserted. Platforms and tracks lay silent and empty. We went to a platform where I told him he probably came in from Davos that fateful last night in 1931. And here, I added, if you were going home to Dublin in them days, you would have caught the night train to Paris from here, through Zurich and Bâle. Then out from Paris be train and boat to London and Dublin. I wish I was going there now, he said, instead of just being stuck here. Just then, the track before us began to hum and vibrate. And into the station came what seemed like an empty train. It was made up of dark blue carriages, and it rattled to a stop in front of us. There seemed not to be a soul on board. But as the train screeched to a stop, we saw a man looking out a window at us, full of sadness. It was a face I knew. The door opened, and he got out slowly. He stood on the platform before us. Harry, I said, here is someone I want you to meet. It is Monsieur Giacometti, Alberto Giacometti, the sculptor, and he's come all the way here on the night train from Paris, God knows to what end. I thought I was going home, said Alberto Giacometti, back to the Alps of the Bergel. But this is Coire, and I know I have just come here to die. Harry Clarke here is an artist too. He's famous for stained glass work. Huh? Stained glass, said Alberto Giacometti. My uncle Augusto did stained glass. Harry died in Coire, quite by chance, on this night in 1931. He had been up at Davos, seeking a cure for his tuberculosis. Then he came down the mountain, intending to go home. But he died in Coire, and here he still is. To me it is Christmas 1965, said Giacometti, and I am coming to die here too. Let us walk through the city then, I said. The night is far advanced, In a few hours it will be dawn." Giacometti gathered his coat around him and put on his hat. We set out from the deserted station and walked again through the empty streets of the city. Soon we were passing the stonemason's yard. Harry Clarke and Alberto Giacometti were deep in conversation about how depth is expressed in various forms of art, from sculpture to stained glass, and how the sacred is expressed too. I did not want to interrupt their talk, for I sensed that they were happy together. We paused at the Totengut Bridge across the river Plessur. I heard the sounds of the river splashing beneath. "Look," said Harry, pointing into the sky. "It's the star we were told by Angelika Kauffmann to look out for." I looked and saw what seemed to be the morning star, very bright, but now low in the western heavens. "It is the star to guide us into paradise," chuckled Giacometti. "We are 3 wise men come from the east. Let us go on then. Let us follow the star." "But I have no gifts to bring," said Harry sadly. "Oh, yes, you do," said Giacometti. "You have your stained glass. Bring that. And I will bring the last sculpture I was working on." "You really think so?" said Harry, wondering. "Is that the way to do it?" "I am certain of it," said Giacometti. Then, as the two stepped forward, arm in arm, Giacometti turned to me. "Aren't you coming?" he asked. I shook my head. "I cannot cross this bridge," I said. "It's not time for me yet." The other two looked at me and nodded. Then they continued their journey to the other side of the bridge, where I could not follow them, and disappeared into the wooded darkness. Far away behind me, the cathedral bell in Chur was beginning to toll the Angelus for dawn. You have been listening to Harry Clarke's Unquiet Grave by Turlough Conmee, from More Tales Told by a Dubliner. If you enjoyed this story, remember to like, subscribe and share, and comment if you like. And so, until next time, the best of the new year to you.